Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's event. My name is Rob Berger. I am the organizer for the event tonight. Big welcome to all you. Before we get started, just a couple of preliminary matters. Just want to thank a few people who helped make tonight possible. First, I'd like to thank Lisa Kempton, our videographer, who has volunteered her services for the past 2 years. You'll notice in the program, if you need any video services, Lisa's the person to help you out. There's contact information in there. Also, we want to thank Stonewall for providing the facility and the promotional support for this event. We want to thank the Gay Ohio History Initiative for their support. We want to thank the Our Stories program at The Ohio State University. And we want to thank the Ohio Historical Society, all of whom have offered support for this event. Tonight is part one of a four-part series. All the information about the different four parts are in tonight's program. If you have an interest in the other parts, I'd encourage you to attend. They'll all be held here at Stonewall. Part one focuses on the history of the Central Ohio lesbian community, and it's a show and tell event. Hopefully all of you had a chance to take a look at some of the materials up here. After we're finished tonight, we'll also invite anyone to come up and take a look at the materials if they'd like to do so. Tonight we are thrilled to have 4 people present to help us in this walk through lesbian history. On the end we have Deborah Modelmog. Next we have Heather Mitchell. Next we have Susie Simpson. And next we have Jan Britton. And I'll allow the moderator, Deborah, to take over from now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hello. I'm Deborah Modelmog, and I am a professor of English at Ohio State, and I also run the Sexuality Studies program there. I don't know if all of you know this or not, but we have a Sexuality Studies minor and also a graduate interdisciplinary specialization at Ohio State now. So if you have friends or you yourself are attending Ohio State, it's one of the few universities in the country where you can now get both a degree, undergraduate minor, and a graduate degree in sexuality studies. And it's a great degree for GLBT students because we do a lot of our courses in that area. So it's a pretty terrific program. And I really want to thank Rob and Stonewall for inviting me to participate in this event tonight. We have some great memorabilia and historical artifacts, and we have some fabulous people here whose experience and time in the Columbus lesbian community kind of spans the gamut. And because I'm an older woman, I'm not going to tell you exactly how long the gamut is spanned, because I know how that gets as you get older, but I can tell you that we have material here from the 1970s all the way up to the present. There's actually a little biography of everyone in the sort of handbook that you received, so if you want to take a look at that, that would give you more information about all of the panelists. But let me just tell you briefly a few things about them. This is Heather Mitchell to my right, and Heather has started the Our Stories initiative at Ohio State, which is an attempt to collect the gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgendered history at Ohio State from its beginning, whenever that history began, to the present. Next to her is Susie Simpson, who has been in the Columbus community for quite some time and has been involved in, see, I'm being very discreet, has been involved in a lot of organizations, political, music, sort of action organizations, women's organizations, lesbian organizations from the very time that she got here, or at least came out as a lesbian, until the present. She currently runs a rock and roll girls camp where you can actually, if you're a young girl, which excludes me, unfortunately, but you can go and kind of show off your musical talents. And I actually read the article about it in the Columbus Dispatch that was published last year, and it sounds like a really great opportunity for young girls who want to sort of show off their rock and roll music skills. And then next is Jan Britton, who was the first graduate associate with the Women's Studies program at Ohio State University. And so she was there from the very beginning when the program was simply a program, or maybe even just a kind of idea in somebody's mind, and developed into a center and then into a department. And so she could tell you a lot about some of the changes and some of the difficulties and some of the materials that went along with that history of the development of that program. But she's also been involved in a lot of political and women's organizations in Columbus and helping to build a lesbian community here as well. So Jan will have a lot to tell us about that. How we're going to proceed tonight is very informally. There's not a lot of us here. There's a nice crowd, and what we'd like to do is to make this as interactive as possible. So I'm going to sort of start by asking some questions and breaking the ice and getting our panelists to talk about certain things. I'm going to start with some kind of broad general questions that might be fun for us just to all contemplate and for them to start off with. And then I have some more specific questions to ask them based on their individual experience. But as we go along, if you think of anything that you would like to ask, please feel free to jump in. It's not a formal type of event. This is very informal and interactive. And so we'd be happy to get questions from you. I'm going to try and give all the panelists equal time so that nobody kind of hogs the floor. So that's one of my jobs, is to make sure that everybody's getting a chance to say something. But as we kind of wind down at the end, and I'll probably try to stop this about an hour or so from now, that'll give us time to have some questions and answers if you haven't asked them along the way, and also for you to come up and individually talk to the panelists and kind of look at all of the artifacts and objects that they've brought tonight, because there's some really fabulous materials here on these tables. So with that, I'd like to get started. And what I thought I would do is just to kind of break the ice here, is ask each of them, what is your favorite thing that you've brought tonight and why? So Jan, why don't we start with you?
It's a difficult choice for one favorite, but I've brought the premiere issue of Ms. Magazine, which was published in the spring of 1972. And that has a special meaning for me because I was in grad school and I was having a tough time just relating to grad school as a woman. It was pretty alienating. And I was doing a lot of feminist reading at the time. And eventually I sneaked in the back door, to be truthful, of the Gay and Lesbian Workshops Week, and there saw Susie Simpson and Sue Vassbinder and 2 or 3 other people who were actually undergraduates who were doing a panel, who were out, and you were so my hero, Susie. So between that kind of encouragement to come out and the kinds of really stimulating ideas that were circulating at that time, 1972 on, for feminism, those kinds of issues really made it not just possible to live, it was the most exhilarating time of life you can even imagine. So I invite you to flip through that magazine and see what it was like for a young woman who was just trying to figure out how to be a real human being.
Susie, your favorite item that
Well, Jan and I looked at each other and goes, oh God, we have to pick one thing. I don't know. I picked 2, so I'll skip the first one.
Okay.
And actually, this was more representative of how things have changed as far as how we can communicate with each other and spread the word. And this was a thing that we called the Lesbian Coalition Communications Network. Because we didn't have the internet and email then, we had phones. And we had this set up, and the instructions were Linda or Gwen will call 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Roman numerals will then call their respective numbers, 1, 2, 3, and 4. We will then call the 4 people listed on the
What was it called? Phone tree?
But it was officially set up so that when you wanted to get the word out about something or something was happening, this is how you did it. Because, I mean, like I said, we didn't have, that was the only way we had to get a hold of each other back then. But there's one thing in here, and it says there are lots of spaces left that we can fill in as we recruit. But that is one thing I think that has changed the whole realm of what our movement's been able to do, is having the internet and email to spread the word and get things out there and for people to connect with each other. So, but we did it back then the best we could.
How many people did that tree reach?
Well, on here, this was just the part that had the 1 and the 4, so there was one. 5, 10, 15, 20. There was 20 on here, but then each of them had, others under them. So. We had, I mean, when we did the concerts and stuff, we would have easily 100 at most of those.
Oh.
I mean, if not more, and some of them we had even like 300 or 400. It was much, back then, it didn't matter who you brought. People wanted to come because you were craving that energy and space that happened. Now you have to drag them to get out. But,
Mine is, and I should say first of all that the collection at Ohio State's probably going to become so large at some point we have to kind of start with scope. So the area that I've been working with over the last year has been largely through student affairs and the development of their history collection. The earliest artifact I have is from 1972, and it's an internal memo between the executive vice president and the head of campus security. And the memo is advising administration on how to deal with the homosexuals on campus. And why it's really interesting to me as a woman is that we're not really mentioned at all. And if you go through the memo, you'll see that homosexuals are referred to as people who might potentially wear dresses in public, and how you would respond to somebody in such a situation. And that somebody could tell me I can't wear a dress in public is laughable. So it's interesting for me to read. And then I think probably I am going to talk about a second thing just quickly. And it's the timeline at the top of this storyboard. It records the coordinators and graduate assistants who worked in the GLBT Student Services Office. And there are a significant number of women who started off as students and then became professionally employed at the university. So in terms of understanding our history, we have a lot of the history makers who are still present, and I think that's a really valuable resource for us.
Well, you kind of come into my next question, which is, what is the oldest thing that you've brought? And because I think you said the memo was from
72.
And that was the oldest thing.
That's the oldest one,
Right.
absolutely.
Okay, so I'll ask you something different. But Jan, what's the oldest thing that you have on the table then?
I think the oldest thing, it might be a tie between some of the very earliest issues of Women Are Human, which was an information newsletter on resources by and about women in the Women's Studies, or before the Women's Studies Library, in the OSU library system. It was, I have all the permutations of it here. It was started by undergraduate librarians, and they recruited other librarians and faculty, and eventually students, anyone who wanted to write for it, just to make sure that people were aware of resources in the library, books, periodicals, and pamphlets, and that sort of thing. And they're short reviews, and they got longer and longer and more professional. And the other thing that dates from that time also, it's a button that I'm especially fond of because it came from the very first All-Ohio Gay Pride Convention and March. And it really was a march, not a lesbian gay celebration. It was a march. It was a political event, and it felt pretty scary. But we had people from all over the state, Bowling Green, Toledo, Cincinnati, Cleveland, and we made a lot of good contacts out of that. You can, this is a button I wear every Gay Pride Day. It's purple and pink, and it says Gay Pride on the outline of the state. So I'm just especially fond of that one.
What year was that, Jan?
That was 1972,
Okay.
spring 72.
And that was the first march in Columbus, is that?
I think it was.
And do you remember how many people attended or marched?
1,000 maybe?
Were there protesters out there like we
I
see
don't think they
now?
were even aware of us yet.
But you were scared of police or the community that you were?
It just you felt pretty naked out there on the street proclaiming yourself gay in 1972.
And so you had signs and buttons and things like that? Yeah, and would you remember where you marched?
I remember being in front of the stadium, but that I think might have been a social thing. I don't know, it just seemed like an insane thing to be meeting in front of Ohio Stadium where they do the tailgating. And then we marched downtown to the State House, I believe. Does it match your recollection?
Your memory's better than mine.
That's a long
Uh,
Do you remember marching down there?
I remember the marching, but I wasn't even from here, so I had no idea where I was. You know, like I really don't, and I was pretty young, so.
But to march from Ohio State to the State House is quite a trek, and so that must have been a little nerve-wracking to go through.
We were younger then.
Walk up sidewalks.
When the Christians finally figured out that we were having gay pride marches in June, my friend Linda Thornburg used to videotape those marches. And there was one particular year when the Christians had gathered on a certain bridge on the way downtown. And Linda was videotaping all the way there, and when she got to the bridge, the camera kicked out. It went into static. And until she got on across the bridge, and then it began to work again. I don't know what that says about the power of Christian prayer,
But I think one thing, just to go on what Jan said, it was like being out there, and it was like as lesbians was even more, because even people that recognized there were gay people or homosexuals, lesbians weren't included in that mix. We were something different, and they didn't think of us when they thought of homosexual or gay. So you had to be blatant and go on the street and wear your buttons and hold hands and for them to like even realize that you existed.
Well, what about you? What's the oldest thing that you've brought tonight?
I don't know, other than me. Probably the anti-war stuff, and because what I saw happen then was a lot of women got involved in the Vietnam War, anti-war stuff, and the women's liberation group, and then you realized, and then the gay groups, but these men were treating us, how should we say, not right. And the lesbian groups kind of evolved out of that, I think, or the political lesbian groups here in Columbus.
Evolved out of the
The
Anti-war
anti-war movement and the women's liberation movement, that kind of all just piggybacked off
which was
each other.
something that happened nationwide as well.
So when you hear the history of gay men talking about Columbus, it's a whole different kind of scene for what they saw happening and what was happening in their world.
And were you aligned and allied with the gay men at first, and then you splintered off into your own lesbian collectives?
Yeah, the men just really didn't get it.
Didn't get the gender.
They didn't get that they were being really sexist and offensive in some of the things that they said and did. And I've forgotten the one thing that I thought was just some man said something in front of me and I thought, that's the last straw. I should have written it down, shouldn't I? Because it was classic.
Yeah, and one of the things I brought was talking about a sexuality panel that David Treadwell and I did, and it even says, this was a report on it that somebody did, and it was like, well, everyone focused their questions to David. And, hardly asked me anything, which I don't remember it, so I was glad to read that. But, people just didn't see us as viable, and even the anti-war movement, which was supposed to be progressive liberal people, those men were the same. They were sex objects.
And so, were there formal lesbian groups or maybe informal lesbian groups that came out of this decision to kind of, form your own?
We were gay women saphoncified. I don't know how we came up with that, but
I do.
how did we? It was Sappho. So.
One of the members' mother had a saying every time she was, watering the lawn or, mixing batter or something like that, she would say, I think that's sufficiently saphoncified. And we thought it was a great pun on Sappho, so we became gay women saphoncified. But when I arrived, it was the Gay Liberation Front, which shows you how political it was. And then it became Columbus OSU Women's Liberation, and I had a mission statement for them, which for some reason didn't arrive here with me tonight, to my surprise. And then the gay men and the women who wanted to work with them renamed themselves as the Gay Activists Alliance. And then we had a lot of women splintering off into the Women's Action Collective and Columbus OSU Women's Liberation. And then we had the social groups forming, Sophoncified and later Central Ohio Lesbians.
And could you say a little bit more about the Women's Action Collective?
Oh, that was an intellectual powerhouse. The thing that was really distinctive about early political formation in the 70s, it was probably as exciting as having the internet just at the beginning, except that instead of everybody discussing things all over the whole country, women in Albany and Madison and Iowa City and San Francisco and Charlotte and all over the country were all discussing things differently. They were discussing different issues, and then they were cranking up their little mimeograph machines and putting out these little things, or publishing a little newsletter and exchanging ideas that way. So you had communities that were socialist feminist and radical feminist, communities that were working on sexuality or employment or all of these different issues, and it was very intellectually exciting to finally begin to swap these things. But Columbus was a real hotbed of intellectual development, particularly about organizations, how organizations would work for the betterment of women. We had some really brilliant people here. I keep waiting for Caroline Sparks to win the MacArthur Genius Grant. She deserves it.
Do you want to say more about her?
She was one of the founding geniuses of the Women's Action Collective, and I had their mission statement that I just read over last night, and then it didn't make it into my little basket either. But it was a loose collective for working groups. There was a women's cooperative garage, there was Women Against Rape, there were groups working on video, music at different times. There was a gay women's peer counseling group affiliated with it. There were all of these different groups that were free to form under the umbrella of the Women's Action Collective and bring in their own money and get a little bit of financial and organizational support to form, to disband as they needed.
A lot of those groups were a lot of the same people starting all the groups, and then we had meetings every night for something different, but we got a lot of groups started.
Well, Women Against Rape was out of that too, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, I thought you said that. And I just wanted to tell you that just last week I taught my kindergartners the child self prevention curriculum that came out of that. It's still going on today.
That's just fantastic.
Heather, why don't we, since we're talking about sort of lesbian leaders and new groups that are being formed at the time, do you know, I know you've kind of focused on particular areas of GLBT history at OSU, but do you have any stories yet about some of the lesbian leaders that started groups at OSU?
Well, most of the information that I have is not from the student perspective so much, but again from the administrative perspective. And so Willie Young was somebody who was very actively involved, and again, she was, I think, the first graduate assistant in the GLBT Student Services Office. So as she progressed in her career, she was involved in a lot of different organizations that have gone through different development over time. Eunice Hornsby is somebody who works in human resources, and she started off working in residence life and talked about living with her partner and not actually being allowed to have a same-sex partner living with her in the university housing that was provided for her. So they had a telephone system where when she would call home to her partner, the phone would ring 2 times and then she would hang up, and that's how she knew it was okay to answer the phone when she called home. So I spoke with Deb Baum, who's the director of the women's place, and she talked about being a law student at Ohio State and going through an experience in the 70s where she was part of a group that first started forming around feminist issues, and they wanted to help the new women law students feel comfortable and have a place where they could get support. So that was a group that they started in her second year in law school. And then by the third year, they thought, well, we need a group like this for gay students who are coming into law. So she has this story that she tells about how they approached the dean and asked for permission to participate in the law school orientation. And he said, no, you're not allowed. You're not an official organization. And so they went back then and became an official organization, did the paperwork, and were still told, no, you can't participate. And so then they asked for a formal meeting with the dean, and one person was in charge of taking notes and making a big dramatic effort of writing down every single word that was said. And another person was in charge of answering all of the questions, and another person came at it from asking questions. And so there's this collaborative effort of making sure that they wanted to build something to protect people who were going to come in after them, but really in a unified, assertive way kind of took control of their lives. And I think that that's something that I've heard about consistently through stories that people are sharing.
Mm-hmm. Like trying to fight reluctant administrators and figure out backdoor ways to get things done.
And really, it seems a lot of times people keep coming back to this idea of we want to make something better for the people who are coming in next. And so kind of from my own naive place, I've said, who are your role models? Who did you look up to, or whose example did you follow? And there's this silence, because they did not have the same experience I had, where all of these people have done so much before me. And so there is a long history of organizations and policies and that sort of thing. And to have those people available to us is a really great resource. So it's been great for me personally.
Let me ask you about some things that I don't even know what they mean, but they showed up in either your bio or Rob provided them to me. What about the protest at the Red Door restaurant?
Yeah.
The
See,
Red
some of you
Door
are chuckling,
restaurant,
so you
which still exists on East Fifth Avenue, had a separate lunchroom. It's at least 2 or 3 rooms in there. And one of the rooms was a men's only room during lunch. And there was a protest about that. And when the restaurant was approached, they did not want to give up their businessmen's lunchroom, even though it was pointed out to them that there were actually businesswomen in what year was that, 74, 5, something like that. Anyway, one of the restaurant patrons was quoted as saying that they didn't want to have to share their businessmen's lunchroom with hens. So that was just waving a red flag in front of the hens. So we had a picket line out there going around in front of the restaurant during the businessmen's lunch day, and that was the end of their peace of mind. I don't think they do that men's lunchroom anymore.
So it was successful?
It took a while because they wanted to dig their feet in. The very fact that they were being challenged, nobody wants to seem to be caving into pressure, but it happened.
And then it was, I mean, when something like that happened, you called and everybody was there.
That's right, that's what the phone drew.
Susie, tell us about your involvement with the Women's Music Union, which was apparently a local volunteer production company for the lesbian entertainment circuit. And music is so important in the lesbian community, as you know, and so I'm very fascinated to hear about this.
It started by a group of local women who actually played music because there was no place that would really let us play. We weren't bar music, and we could do coffee houses and stuff like that, but there was no places. So we formed this women's music union to try and provide places for us to play. And it happened at the same time that the lesbian music circuit was just starting, and somehow somebody got a call from the Berkeley Women's Music Collective, and they were going to be coming through. Did we want to produce them? And we were like, yeah. And that was it for 10 or 15 years, or however long we did it. And then we did maybe 1 or 2 variety shows or local concerts for ourselves, and we did the lesbian circuit of performers, which a lot of these posters and flyers are from.
So bringing in national musicians.
Yeah, like Meg Christian, Chris Williamson, Marty Adam, Wallflower Collective, Holly Near.
Well, could you say a little
Tillery.
bit more about those concerts? Because I remember going to Holly Near and Chris Williamson and Tret Fury when I first came here in the mid-'80s. And it seemed to be very well attended by that time. So were they popular immediately, or did you have to?
It was that whole thing back then where, you know, you did the phone tree, or we've got somebody coming. And honestly, it didn't matter who they were because nobody knew who these performers were then. It was gonna be this women's concert and they were packed because you wanted that energy and the feelings that were created. And then people's names became known.
Did you ever have trouble finding venues for these people to perform in?
Not really. We used a lot of churches. The 16th Avenue let us use their space a lot. Hillel. As we got bigger and bigger, we started using the Hughes Hall on campus, other spaces. Now, Linda Apple had actually the first art gallery in the Short North back in the early 80s. And we did variety shows and some concerts there.
And I noticed that you have, I think it's you or maybe it's Jan, have one of the original posters from the Michigan Women's Festival. Is that yours?
I've got the one from the very first one.
Okay, could you all say a little bit more about that? And like, did you take a contingent of women from Columbus to Michigan, or? See, you, it's good that I'm naive about this, right?
I actually played in a band back then. And
Which one?
What was the name of your band?
Lotta Crabtree. I thought you were. It's like you were there.
Prompting me.
Okay, say it again.
Lotta Crabtree.
Lotta Crabtree? Lotta? Okay. I'm just trying to get this down for the
We were
historical
a fun
record.
time band. We took a lot of old mountain songs and changed the lyrics to be lesbian or feminist.
Do you remember any of the lyrics?
I have a book. I was the lyric changer, so I do have the book.
But can you like hum a few bars?
No.
Or?
I was not the singer.
Well, how about just can you say a few bars? Like I like to hear what the change was.
What
did you play, Susie?
All right, let me think about that, and I'll come back to that.
I want to know what instrument did you play?
I played the mandolin and spoons and hand drums.
And so I'd like to know how you changed the lyrics to make them lesbian. Was it? It wasn't
We
just.
had, okay, somebody found an old Annette Funicello 45 in their attic and gave it to us, and it was called Act Feminine. So we took that. It was like act feminine, be feminine, smile, you'll catch a guy. It was like, we didn't actually change the lyrics to that. We left them the same, but we put mask on and we put Girl Scout. I think we had mask on the back of our head and then we turned around again. We tried to be entertaining. It was performance art back then. But back to Michigan, we actually said,
I don't know. We might stay here for a while because I'm actually kind of enjoying this.
National was first.
What was?
National was first. National Miss Music.
Oh, National Women's Music Festival. And where was that held?
Bloomington.
Bloomington.
Oh, so it was because I know it was in Bloomington recently.
No, it was in Champaign-Urbana,
Oh,
Illinois
yeah.
first, and then Bloomington.
Okay. And now it's moved again, hasn't it?
Normal, Illinois.
Okay.
July 5th to the 8th. 2007.
And what an interesting place to have
Flyers
it.
back there.
What an interesting place to have it. Normal, Illinois.
Yes.
Okay. But go ahead and talk about Michigan.
Oh, so Lisa Vogel, who was one of the organizers, was in town and met Bonnie at Women's Studies, I believe, anyway, and so wanted us to come and play. So we had, I don't know, the flyer I had was like a hand-drawn thing where they just penciled in the people that got it. And it was truly quite an experience because you would be camping out. We had a little camper we actually drove up that we borrowed from someone. It didn't make it back, but it made it up. But it would be in the middle of the night. There's men on the land. And all these women would run out and run. Thank God we never found any. But we were bound and determined this was our space and we were going to protect each other, and it was, I don't know, it's quite hysterical at times. But
That first year, we did not have a good relationship with the surrounding town.
Right.
And the people were curious. People would just come and park on the edges of the land and stare in to see, they're naked, you know, they don't have shirts on, which is why they were coming around in the middle of the night, I'm sure. But they learned a lot from that, and after that they cultivated a relationship with the community so that they had a financial stake in the music festival, and it was a welcome event.
yes,
But that first
And
year,
they made money.
that was tense, waking up every
and the
night.
planes would fly over.
Yes, they were renting planes, little private planes, to watch the women be shirtless.
Well, I do. Okay, now that I have people here who know about that tradition, I would like to know, how did it start? Did women just start taking off their shirts there, or was there just an assumption that this was a safe place? And
Well, one quote I remember women saying was, "I feel like I died and went to heaven," because they felt like they were in a safe space where they could do anything they wanted.
and so
it was
taking
hot.
shirts off.
It was hot, man, it was very hot.
There you go, okay.
How many women were there the first year? Ish.
I'm goodness, it was less than 1,000. I'm gonna say maybe 500 or 600. That's all true.
And were there quite a few performers, or?
Yeah.
So they had a full slate of performers, and did they have workshops like they have now?
Why?
I don't think there were
That's
workshops
actually-
at the very,
There were no organized workshops.
yeah, they weren't organized
This is just
workshops.
really bad art because that's not how you play a flute, even if you're not a What they provide, camping and packing place on this bare naked, hot meadow, portable toilets, drinking water, simple vegetarian foods, which is to say raw fruits and vegetables, bread, cheese, granola, and that's pretty much it. First aid, a canopy for the listening, no, there was not a canopy. No, it was Sunburn City. Childcare and security, all of which was to be shared. You had to bring everything else. Here's the schedule. There are not actually workshops listed, but it does have a political statement because you had to have a political statement for everything at that time. And then there's a little map here. It was only at this site the first year, and then after that it moved to Hesperia, then to Hut. In this place, it was just a meadow outside of Mount Pleasant. A meadow. Anyway, that'll tell you all about it. 1976.
It was fun. The food was terrible.
It was.
Everybody took their own food the next year.
Well, Jan, another thing that I'm interested in, and apparently you have been involved with, is Columbus's first professional women's football team.
Yeah, I don't know what came over me. The idea of playing tackle football, I was there. There was a team in Toledo, which was really good. They've been around for a while, and a team in Dayton and one in
Oklahoma City.
Detroit. And Oklahoma City, yes, Oklahoma City. And here was our poor little brand new team. We had less experience than a Pop Warner football team, but we practiced like crazy. We got our pads, we got our uniforms, and I've got a picture of some of us in the locker room and myself doing the formal pose up here. That was 1975-76. It was professional, but we didn't get paid that year. The next year they were going to get paid
You gave all your money
$10 per
back.
game.
We gave all our money back. That's what. Keep it going.
Well, we played one game in a driving thunder and lightning and rainstorm, and we got blown out every game, something on the order of 60-0. We were very inexperienced. But Linda what was her name? Linda
Jefferson.
Jefferson. No, I'm thinking of the one from the Toledo team who was Athlete of the Year for Women's Sports Magazine.
Yeah, yeah.
And she was amazing.
She's in the football.
She was so
Hall of Fame.
fast. All you could do, I mean, why bother chasing her? All you could do was just admire. There she goes. I have some more stories about my year playing football, but I didn't go back to play the second year because it seemed like you put women in uniform and you put them on the sidelines and we kind of were turning into men. And I just didn't want to do that anymore.
In what way?
Oh, people were getting really aggressive, and standing on the sideline and swearing, and it just became, I thought, boy, this is kind of ugly. I don't think I want to be like this. So 1 year was good fun, but that was all I needed.
Susie, what about, Rob mentioned her earlier, what about Sue Vossbinder?
Actually, Sue was the first out gay person to run for undergraduate student government, a ticket with, I forget his name.
At Ohio State?
Yeah, at Ohio State, 70 something, 3 or 4. We ended up being roommates for a while, not lovers, we were roommates. She got a lot of flack for that. People would call and play, you think I'm going out of my head, hang up. She moved in with me because somebody threw a brick through her window. And it was a crazy time back then. And she was very brave and
So she was the first out lesbian to run for student government at OSU? Because now we have an out student president, government president.
Right.
So it took quite a while for that to happen, but that's one of the ways that times have changed. I don't think Ryan's had anybody throwing bricks through his window.
right.
And Heather, since we're kind of moving back to OSU, what are some of your favorite stories, maybe about students or about sort of the early history of GLBT students and staff and back to OSU?
It's really, they all overlap, which is, I think, what I really have found to be most interesting, just learning about how the communities developed and how the students, in some cases, became staff and in some instances became the alum who formed the scholarships that kind of keep it all rolling together. I think what's been most interesting for me is just seeing how much of the programming actually occurred. Again, from, like you were saying earlier, the same people kind of trying to reach people through a variety of venues. And so when you look at some of the literature, the handouts, the flyers that were up, it just looks like so much was going on at the time. And I kind of was comparing it to what do our calendars look like now? Why are they doing so much? But maybe we have more institutionalized supports that already build in some of the activities that people are participating in. So it's not really so much a story because a lot of what we've collected up to this point has been paper. So it's more a picture, an overall picture of the development of the community.
Like what kind of posters would you find?
Well, mostly information about Gay, Lesbian, and Bisexual Awareness Week. If you take a look at some of the things that we have up here, let's see. So we have an out art festival, the bagel brunch, all by myself, and there were opportunities for people to kind of get involved with cluster groups, so people could actually get involved with religious organizations. Hillel was always really involved. There was a clip about controversy with the Catholic Church and the whole AIDS crisis that was developing in the 80s, and conversations between students and faculty about how can you be a practicing Christian and also be gay. So I think just the increase in visibility, particularly during the 80s, as groups became more expected and visible on campus, we began seeing people who really reach out to their different kind of subsectors of the gay population instead of just being part of the GAA or the women's collectives.
Do you find, there's less funding now? I think there was more funding back then with the different groups, not that there was a lot, but I know there was always a women's week, there was always a gay awareness week of some sort, and now it's like, you don't hear about, groups don't seem to have very much money to do programs and stuff.
I think a lot of the funding early on came from special grant proposals. There was a safe space proposal which was written by the counseling center initially to create an office where everybody could be kind of centrally located. Someone wrote an affirmative action grant proposal early on. So there was money coming in from specific places that had an interest in developing community. And so after I think the African American communities and the Hispanic communities, they kind of paved a lot of the road for other people to come up and ask for more. There were opportunities for people to ask for those resources. Whereas now we're kind of all part of this decentralized budget system within the university. So we're fighting for dollars the way everyone else is. I don't know, what do you think?
Well, I think the Multicultural Center funds the GLBT student services, so we still have like Pride Week and a lot of other events there, and they're pretty well funded. I mean, it's not, thousands and thousands of dollars, but they have quite a bit of funding through that office. I think my sense is that there's so many different groups, taking place now that there's not that kind of energy that you're talking about that you had in the early days. A lot of the groups seem to be more social than political, although there definitely are still political groups there. And there's still a lot of concern and issues around race and disability and gender, and so there's still people who are really focused on those issues as well. But it is, I think one of the great things now is that it seems to be much more accepted at Ohio State, and people don't make a big fuss about it in general. You don't have, huge protests. We did have a big protest a few years ago because the, what was their name, the Christian Legal Society wanted to exclude gays and lesbians from membership in their group, even though they were funded by the university. And the university decided in their favor that they should be able to have that exclusion. And so we've written letters and all sorts of things, but that hasn't changed. So there are still some, pockets of disapproval. And some of us feel in our classes that some of the students have gotten much more conservative, and we get emails every now and then from, I do in sexuality studies, from students who are upset with some of the things that we're teaching. But not very often, What I get more of is just students very happy to know that sexuality studies exists and just thrilled that they can study their own lives and in a positive way. But that leads me to, because women's studies at OSU was kind of the forerunner of all of this, and it was such an important group on campus, intellectual center, political center, and so could you tell us, I know you were involved with it from the very beginning, and it really was a place where a lot of lesbians sort of congregated and felt, safe and at home, and at the same time I know that there were tensions. So could you say a little bit more about the sort of beginnings of the Women's Studies Department at OSU?
There was a committee of women to discuss the possibility of forming a women's studies program of some kind. And that predated my arrival here. I think they began to meet in, after the student protests and the big riots on campus in 1970. That was before I got here. But the two things that came out of that were a demand for an OSU childcare facility that students and staff and faculty could all use. And the other thing was beginning to talk about women's studies. We got an office formed in 1975, and I came on staff. We had a tiny room in University Hall, all of us in one room, and we would just try to make a lot of appointments so we could go out and network with faculty. And then we got our office in the welding engineering building. That was a big deal. So our first staff had 2 graduate students, a director, a funding specialist, a curriculum specialist, and a couple of undergraduate student assistants. And our mission was to lay the groundwork for and decide what sort of structure we were going to want. And the governing body was a committee of women, and we were answerable to the university. We had a particular dean who pushed us really hard intellectually, so I guess he was a good adversary because he made us do our homework and make sure that we were setting a good groundwork. In 1975 we formed. In 1980 we finally got the approval to be a Center for Women's Studies, and I have the photographs of the celebration up here. And the t-shirt did not last, but the art does. This isn't that beautiful? We had a big, it was a cloth sign for the office, a big one, probably about the length of the wall, and then everybody got one of these t-shirts. So we've got some pictures of that little celebration too. There was cake, there was a cake and a t-shirt, so that was quite an accomplishment. But along the way it was an extremely painful experience because one of the governing tenets of life in Columbus was we will rule by consensus. Consensus didn't mean at that time that the strong people got their way and the weaker people either didn't care that much or they acquiesced. You actually talked it through so that by the time the decision was made, everybody felt okay about it. And that was not something that the university was quite able to get its mind around, the whole interim governing board. So that was not something that was going to last when we finally did get institutionalized, but boy, it sure was an interesting struggle along the way. But they've lasted, they've prevailed, they've got faculty, they're fine, and we're proud of them.
And in fact, one of their PhD tracks is now sexuality studies. So, and they have people who specialize in lesbian studies and sexuality studies. So.
I don't think two of our original staff would be especially happy about that development. Even in women's studies, you've got people who don't want lesbians to be so noisy.
Susie, can you tell us about the Moonshine Co-op?
It was a community bar set up by some folks from ComFest, actually, up on North 4th and 11th. And it was one of the few places that would let women play sometimes. Not always, but sometimes. It didn't last very long, I don't know, a couple of years maybe at that.
And was that one of the places where Lotta, what was it, Lotta?
Crabtree.
Lotta Crabtree.
Yep.
That's what
We played a lot of very weird places.
And what about Jack's A Go-Go? Is that a music place as well?
That was our first lesbian bar. And this was a well-worn t-shirt.
And is that the Jack's that's on Summit Street?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's called Jack's?
It's one of the oldest lesbian bars in the country that still exists, although it's now owned by a gay man. But that was the only place that we had to go back then.
Could you say a little more about it and what it was like to go there and how big it was?
It wasn't very big.
It was packed.
And it was gay every night, right? It was lesbian every
It
night.
was owned by Cleta and her husband, but they liked us girls. And it didn't matter how old you were. They didn't check IDs. You could go there.
There was no opportunity for men.
Yeah, there was
Men had to be tourists, they'd have to pay $5.
And was there music there, like live music, or was it
Not always.
records?
Not usually, but
Pool and a
bands
jukebox,
played there sometimes.
usually.
Dancing?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Dancing,
Had to
pool.
dance.
Thursday night was the night.
And what way?
Thursday night, everybody, I mean, you planned your whole week around.
For years.
Before you just, Thursday night, you knew you had to get there, usually by 7, so that you could get a good seat, you know. And then the women would just, they came from everywhere, because there was, at that time when I first came there, I was still in high school. I didn't even know where I was going. And I was just trying to be with the big kids, you know. And you went and there'd be a line, and people just packed in there. They'd be in there like this, and they had cheap pitcher beer and just music, and it was fantastic. I mean, inside that space, just like all kinds of wild, exciting stuff was going on. I'm serious, you know? It was like, oh my God. You know?
Like what? Tell us.
Just like, you know, women being free to be hitting on each other and touching each other, and even for me, like drinking like that in a way, like, you know, just like drinking and having a good time and smoking and just all these and like, talking in these ways, fighting. It was a lot of working class, you know. It was a lot of, at least from my viewpoint, working class women. You know, got off work, worked hard all week, and you know, got that night off to come in there, and there are like a lot of really butch women in there, which I was just fascinated by, because I never really seen more than maybe one out of the corner of my eye. You know, they were like really butch, masculine women that were proud and all their muscles and all that, you know, just like going around and, you know, doing all of this stuff and buying cocktails, and just, it was just fantastic, and dancing, and just a band that, you know, it was just free abandon. When you went inside that space and you felt protected, I mean, there were always like the really strong women that would hang around there, and if a guy would come in there, he'd probably only get about halfway before, you know, maybe if they were lucky to get to the back.
The door.
Because even then, back then, you didn't really, once the sun started to go down, you really didn't come dragging a guy up in there, even if he was your friend. The women did not, it was clearly understood that it was not a space for men. They were not tolerated. They were not, and you know, these women would pick fights with them and everything, and I just thought it was fantastic. I did, I just can remember that, and we would, you know, just do everything we had to do to slip out of town and scoot up to Columbus on Thursday night.
Where were you coming from?
Zanesville, which is 55 miles east, down on the river.
Now, why was it Thursday night? Because you would think the weekend.
I don't know, but it stayed that for years and years and years.
Someone had told
It would change a little bit, but it was always.
Someone had told me it started with softball. It had started with the softball team, and that, who I guess their softball team played on Thursdays. And a lot of the women back then played on Thursday nights. I don't know. I don't know if that was really true, but it seemed like
It would be DJ night, whatever they
And
called
DJ,
it. It
yeah.
didn't matter over the years. It just stayed Thursday
that
night
way.
was the night to go.
but remember back then, Thursday was the day that you wore green. If you were gay, like there was this big like thing, you know, it wasn't easy being green. Oh well, it was green. Well, it was green where I was from. And on the slide, if you wanted other people to know you were gay, you would wear green on Thursday. It came from that whole Kermit the Frog. It ain't easy being green. I swear. And it just, you know, I don't know. Thursday just always was gay day as far as I ever did.
It was also, like women who were professors at Ohio State would not go there. They should run into a student.
They wouldn't go there?
No.
Because they were afraid
If they weren't comfortable, if they saw a student there, then oh my gosh, that would be the end of the world. Not for all, there were a few, but
When I first started going, it was so much identified as a working class bar that they weren't really sure. I mean, they were quite welcoming, but there was a real division between those feminist women from the university and us bar women.
The music union had a variety show, and I remember I was gonna bring all those political women together with the bar women and the university women, so we had different acts. Somebody brought a keg of beer, somebody brought a bag of pot, and it was, I don't want to say the police came 3 or 4 times a day because of the noise, and it was just all this, there was a group called the Wandas that did drag, and political women were like running up wanting to unplug the sound machine because 2 years later they were like giving money to them, watching them, but they needed to, and it was, yeah, it didn't work. But.
There was a question way in the back.
I just wanted to say about Jack's that the first time I went there I was 17 and I was straight. But I remember being in there and I was sitting with some people I knew from work. I worked for Columbus Recreation and Parks, a lot of lifeguards there. And I was talking to these women and they had their arms around each other sitting across from me and I said, well actually I'm not lesbian. And they immediately withdrew from each other right in Jack's. So the homophobia, the internal homophobia was just, even, you would have thought that was a completely safe place, but even in Jack's, people were still afraid.
So they were afraid that you, because you were a straight woman, that you were there to...
That I was going to judge them or something, I guess. But I was, back the next year and I was out, so it was all right.
Yeah, how about way in the back?
I have a question about the bars and the events where men were not allowed. What do you ladies feel about that? Because you were speaking earlier about the restaurant where it was only men in certain rooms. So how do you reconcile that with the bars or other events where men weren't welcome or were actually asked to leave?
Well, we weren't welcome in the men's bars either. Gay women, from my perspective, felt it was the same thing as the women's liberation. We had to get our strength, and so a lot of our anger was directed at men, whether they were gay or straight, because we were oppressed by men. Back then it was like we couldn't work together. Like I said, the gay men's movement back then was very different and didn't evolve the same way that the gay women's movement did. And I think the Grapevine was probably the first club where gay men and women actually had a place to come together, drink and talk, and like, hey, yeah, you're okay. Yeah. I mean, not that there wasn't connections and that people weren't friends, but it was just whole different scenes going on.
It felt necessary at the time, which was why it felt wonderful to come back together again to help gay men when AIDS became such a big issue. They needed us, and even though we always suspected that if AIDS had happened to women, especially lesbians, instead of to gay men probably, a lot of them would have just continued on with their lives. But it felt really fine to bring the tribe back together again when the men needed us and they knew they needed us.
Yeah, and Jack's wasn't always a safe. I mean, there were men who came in there and tried. There were many fights. I mean,
Well, right next door was the biker or whatever that was next door. So it was always somebody coming over on bets, and the college guys would, for their fraternities and stuff, on bets, would come up there and try to come in, and the whole thing was for them to get a drink and last through the drink, which
all you need is a good lay. Or
say something like that.
You've just never been with a good man.
I used to live up on the corner of Summit and Alden, and I actually saw women chasing men down the street.
That's one of my proudest moments, I will tell you. This came from my softball days. We came out, there was like 3 or 4 of us walked out, and my friend was sitting over on the ledge. There wasn't a fence there. And this guy was sitting beside her, and it was like all of a sudden he just up and cold cocked her. So I was like, well, he took off running. We took off running. He ran through the alley, back through this other, and ran up to a friend's house and started pounding on his door. Well, I was about that far away, and I picked up this rock, and I just went, right as he turned around, I hit him right in the stomach. He never came back.
We were pissed off.
Yeah. Don't you think Columbus, though, is very unique with our community, the way that we are now? We really are one as a GLBT community, and even though we have our little fights and our little squabbles, and then we're all for a common cause, because I've traveled a lot, and I've noticed that it is very segregated in other cities. The girl night at the bar that is the gay bar is the girl night is on a Thursday, and so we didn't really have our own businesses in other cities. We don't today even some, but I think Columbus is very unique that we are all brothers and sisters. I mean, I know at Stonewall Columbus we feel very much that way, even though we have, the management maybe be women. It doesn't mean that our brothers are not. I mean, they're behind us 100% in this fight. And so, don't you feel that way, or am I? I mean, just in my travels, I've felt that we're pretty unique as a city.
Yeah, I think once we came back together, it's like, yeah. Well, and as we became stronger and more confident as women, it was like, oh, okay, we don't really hate men. We hate what they stand for and what they've done to us all these years. So hopefully we've come a long way.
Didn't you think we mixed well at the Kismet though? Everyone would go and dance.
Oh,
And
right,
that was a great place to be.
Yeah, you
And
had
that
the
was where I
Kismet,
went
that was
first.
great, but then you had the Garage and Herbie's, who one week you were
Imaginations.
allowed in and one week you weren't, or you were allowed in if you wore a dress or because they didn't want you. I mean, it was a lot of that going on back then, but yeah, the Kismet, you could do your drugs or go dance.
Okay, yes. Go ahead. Yeah, you.
Talk to me about AIDS in the 80s. If this was a panel of men, I would have thought of that question a long time ago. Because you guys are women, sometimes we forget that lesbians were so active back then and they helped the gay men back then. Tell me about how that affected the lesbian community as well.
I just remember when you first started hearing about it, it was caused by poppers. And everybody's going, oh, Lord, we're all in trouble because everybody did that on the dance floor. Boy, I don't know. Do you want to speak to that one?
It was such a long time and such a mean time when AIDS was identified exclusively with gay men, and it began to really grate on me. There were such mean things said. Men were left to get sick and to die alone, and that's when I joined the Columbus AIDS Task Force, and I was matched up for several years with different men. I seemed to specialize in men who were near death for some reason. And it was a really wonderful experience. The Columbus AIDS Task Force was a very classy organization, just a really, it was a good thing because my father and one of my cats were dying at the time that I took the training to be a buddy, and I really cherish that. It's a wonderful organization. After that, I volunteered at the health department for the AIDS testing for several years, and it was a really satisfying thing. After going through just aggravating experiences with men at the beginning of feminism, it did feel good to be gay people together again. We can roll our eyes at one another, but we are friends, and it'll stay that way.
Well, you started to answer a kind of a big question that I have for you, and as the evening winds down, maybe you can address this one, and then we'll ask for questions from the audience. But that is, what do you see as the big changes between the lesbian community? Is that you? Cell phones.
Turn it off. Sorry.
One of the big changes, or what do you see as the big changes between, and that can be anywhere from like politically, in terms of differences within the community, in terms of relationally, in terms of identifications, you know, like what do you call yourself? What do you see as some of the big changes? This is for all of you.
We've used different symbols and different words. You notice people don't identify somebody as their lover anymore. You never hear that. That was
Your
so
partner?
standard. Yeah,
Partner? Yeah.
nobody ever says that anymore, I've noticed.
I remember in the 80s, one of my students tried to tell our secretary that her emergency contact was her partner. And the secretary said, well, what do you mean by that? Do you work together? You know, is she your business partner? And finally the student got so frustrated, she said, we sleep together, okay? But that term was just becoming available at that time, and not everybody knew what it meant. And now I hear a lot of heterosexual people use it as well as gay people. It's something else they've stolen from us.
Well, we had consciousness raising groups where we sat and tried to think of other things to call ourselves in our relationships.
I remember somebody suggested in Lesbian Connection one time in probably the mid-80s, calling your girlfriend your sweet friend. I thought that was kind of nice. We've gone through all these different symbols too, the lambda, the pink triangle, I don't know, what
Interlocking
rainbow flags and stickers.
Yeah, the language, I think, I mean, back then, my God, if you said chick or,
Please don't even say that now.
I say it all the time.
I mean, well, but there were things, I mean, in the meetings, and if you said them, you better be sorry. You know, and now, you know, you hear the young kids, they don't call themselves GLBT, they call themselves queer, you know, it's like every generation, I think, comes up with their own labels that they think are what fit them or what they feel fits them the best. I don't know. I think things have changed a lot.
No, it's for the
But I
better.
don't think a lot of things have changed. And I think, you know, at least back then, the prejudices were more out in the open and people were more blatant about it, and you knew eye to eye how they felt, instead of, you know, people pretending that they're cool or that, and when they're really not. I mean, I sat here today in a meeting and listened to a police officer talk about the assaults that have been happening, and well, they weren't really assaults because he didn't really rape those women, and it was just like, oh my God. I don't know, and I thought, okay, we started all these groups back then. We had sensitivity training with police officers. Gay groups have had sensitivity training, and still, you know, you can sit there and say things like this. And I was pretty appalled, actually. I've been ranting about it all day.
I think we're having another sensitivity training with him though, aren't we?
Yeah.
I believe so.
We better.
I think that's next on the agenda, isn't it?
In terms of labels, one of the things that I find delightful, in the 70s and 80s, women would use the term Ms. as a sort of political statement. And now, Karen and I have gotten married. Well, we had a civil union in Vermont and upgraded to marriage in Canada. And so now in her class, on her door outside the classroom, she has Mrs. Andermills. And I love
to call me Mrs.
I love that Mrs. They're using Mrs. as a political.
You hate me, you call me Mrs.
I like the irony.
Just this year for fun.
That's funny.
Heather, what about you? What do you see as some of the big differences between the community and?
Well, when I first started talking to people last year about the Our Stories project, one of the questions I asked was, what do we do with the alphabet soup? The letters that stand for the words that we use to identify ourselves. And it was really interesting. The responses I got from gay men tended to be in favor of gay versus queer, but wanting to use something that was really inclusive and collective. The women I spoke with said, you gotta name everybody. you have to make sure everybody's visible. And so I started keeping a list of all of the different labels that people were suggesting, and we eventually condensed it down to LGBTQIA because we decided not to repeat letters, but it was lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, transsexual, intersex, queer, questioning, asexual, and allies. And that's just exhausting to say. And I was talking with a history professor last fall, and she was talking about being gay in college, and I said, how is it different now? And she said, back then you just didn't get caught. And her voice kind of lowered, and she started speaking very slowly and talked about friends of hers, those who were fortunate and were caught. If their families had means, they'd send them to private hospitals. And if their families didn't have finances, they'd be sent to state institutions. And how she knew someone from college who went through electroshock therapy and was just never the same again. And then we kind of go through this period of time where there's all of this empowerment. And now when I talk with young people, and I've even had this experience myself somewhat, I identify as queer or gay and don't always, for myself personally, think that the lesbian part is quite as important, although I do use it politically. But when I talk with some young people, they don't even think they need to identify at all. And it's their view of their own sexual orientation is so fluid that they say, don't put labels on me. I don't know how that changes 10 years down the road or 20 years down the road when I've had more life experience. I don't know, but it almost seems like it's come full circle a little bit.
But did they know the history?
No, not at all. Not at all. Yeah. Well, I think very much right now they're identifying themselves as where they are right now.
Can I read just 2 sentences here? This was 1972, I think. My lover and I at the time, we did a lot of speaking things in high schools and colleges. And we did this, it was from Denison University, from this feminist professor's class, and she had them write reactions to us being there. And this one woman wrote, my first reaction to Chris and Susie's visit last Tuesday was one of fear. Fear because although I knew lesbian couples existed, I'd never been directly exposed to them and therefore didn't know what to expect. Fear too because I somehow thought they'd look and act horribly different. And this other one, today's class was probably one of the most, if not the most educational classes that I've had since coming to Denison. I was extremely impressed by the frankness which Chris and Susie permitted, and most of all, I admire them for going public and letting our class witness their relationship. This wasn't the one I wanted to read. Oh, I don't know. One of them said where, they thought lesbians were truck drivers and short hair and butch, but I'm like, okay, that was only 72, so that wasn't that many years ago but we weren't visible in the public's eye, even in colleges where you would think, at least there, that people would have an idea that you existed. And these people thought they didn't know any, and I'm sure they did, they just didn't know they did.
There's a wonderful short story by Becky Bertha, who's an African-American lesbian writer, called In the Life. And it's about some older lesbians who are, one of them is actually dying and dies by the end of the story, although now if you're going to read it, I've told. But it's about a younger lesbian who decides that she needs to record their stories to remember the history and to learn about the history. And this night reminds me of that because I think stories like this can be lost if we don't record them for posterity. And the work that Rob and Heather are doing to try to record the history of Central Ohio and of OSU's GLBT communities, I think are so important to us because I think people really need to know where they've come from and how far we've come if we really feel like we have come very far. Because as they're fond of saying in history, if you don't know where you come from, history can repeat itself. And I feel like in some ways we are going through a repetition of some of that history with the horrible rhetoric that is being thrown at us as gays and lesbians. And I believe that violence against gays and lesbians is on the rise. And a lot of people feel uncomfortable going to their churches or coming out to their parents. And most of our homeless youth are gay or lesbian who've been thrown out of their homes. And so I just think it's really important to remember the history and the fight that we fought and how we can continue to fight that fight. And I didn't know I was going to say that, but that's kind of a wrap up. Are there any questions from the audience that we haven't gotten to yet? Yes.
I love hearing about all this stuff because I have no history of that whatsoever. I grew up straight. It came out 8 years ago. And so I always like to hear what everybody went through back then, because myself and people of the younger generation, they have no idea. They just take it for granted. Like my son, my 16-year-old son identifies as a gay boy, and he has no idea, what everybody went through. So for me, the pivotal moment for me was Ellen coming out. That was my pivotal moment of we've arrived, in a sense. So I was curious to know if you had any kind of like pivotal moment or aha moment of we've really made some headway here from all the struggles and everything that you experienced.
Yeah, so many of them, but one that I remember, this is weird, the Democratic Convention in 1972, I was sick, I was lying on the floor because every time I raised my head I'd have to blow my nose, but in the middle of the night, this speech was given by a gay delegate. And I felt so proud. It was just amazing. Even though it was way after prime time, it was one of those moments of arrival for me that they were speaking at a national convention and televised. Boy, that was something special.
I think Meg Christian and Holly Neer and Olivia doing a concert at Carnegie Hall was a major, right.
I don't know yet. It'll happen. Give me time.
Any other lingering questions?
I just would like to thank particularly Susie and Jan, because I was the beneficiary. I was at a couple of meetings at Ohio State of the gay whatever it was called at the time, and I went to every one of those concerts and lived for those concerts and just really benefited from the work that you did here in Columbus. It made a huge impact. And the Women's Action Collective, I got Meg Christian's autograph there, man.
I don't know if everybody knows this, but Susie's going to be honored at the Short North Business Association Gala on Sunday the 17th for an unsung hero of the Short North. She is the head of Kent Rigsby and many other people that were nominated that have made huge contributions as well, but they're actually giving it to her, so we are very proud of her. So congratulations.
What time is it?
I believe it starts at 7. It's at the Greek Church at the SMBA. You can get it online, I think, at the SMBA.
With that, I think we should thank all of our panelists. I thought it was a really wonderful evening and I learned a lot, and I really appreciate your generosity in sharing your stories and taking us on a big trip down memory lane. And could I ask for a round of applause for all of us? I invite you now to talk to them independently and to come up here and look at some of the things that they've brought that are really interesting. Thank you all for coming.